Welcome to the Data Vault Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We run this session here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions about data vaults, data-driven applications, data mining, AI, MPP clusters if you want, all kinds of data-driven questions essentially, cloud computing and so on. If you can use the chat here to raise live questions. You can also use the Q&A function in the client. You can raise your hand. I would give you voice. Don't misuse that, right? Or I can show you, I'll give you a link to a form where you can also submit questions, and then I pick them the way it works essentially and prepare a little slide. Today I was actually doing some graphical work. I'll show you. I don't do much typically. And if you receive multiple questions, I'm cherry picking. Good questions, like 10 minutes to be answered essentially, right? So if it's too large, it's auto problem. And if there would be no questions at all, I would talk about a cluster. Haven't made any progress for the last 1.5 years or so. So because we received questions, it's all good. All right. So let's go for today's question here. If I can find it. There you go. This is a continuation, essentially, of last week's question about non-historized links. And let me just read this here. And here's the graphical part. I used italic for the entities and attributes. Come on. All right. There's a debit and credit card table in General Ledger, about 1 billion or more rows, that stores data about financial transactions with the fields transaction ID, account segment, accounting document, accounting period, debit amount, credit amount, transaction timestamp. Transaction ID alone identifies transaction, but a combination of account segment, accounting document, and accounting period is essentially, and transaction timestamp is also unique. That's the alternate key of the transaction. A couple of hub references because of business keys, the timestamp, that's the transaction ID, as we call it, and the accounting period is a code, reference code, also part of the transaction ID. Well, we call this TID element in a non-historized link, not the transaction ID, not this one here, right? Since the source is fully transactional, then should all fields be put into one transaction link or non-historized link, or split into non-historized link and its satellite. And in the book, in the training, we discuss this. We talk about when you have let's say a wide link or wide fact transaction data essentially with lots of attributes. And we see this, for example, in call records where you have potentially hundreds of attributes on the call. Also on booking transactions sometimes in the bank and so on. The problem is if the number of columns becomes too many, if the row becomes too wide, and depending on the target platform you're writing to, you might not get enough records into a database page anymore. On a row-based storage, the whole row must fit into the page. The whole row must fit into the page, and the number of rows per page is limited by the size of the page and by the size of the row essentially. The wider the row gets, the page size is typically fixed. The wider the row gets, the less records you can get into the page essentially. And that slows down the data ingestion. On the other hand, what we see is also when you, let's say, go for, the alternative would be to go for column-based storage, because then it doesn't matter anymore. Well, what we see also is, especially in the column-based storage, joining a non-historized link with its satellite to perform some aggregations is also a performance killer. The join is the killer here, right? So you want to avoid the join. So but then, yeah, so it's splitting the transaction into multiple tables would be nice from a loading perspective, but it's bad from a querying perspective, especially on column-based storages, because that's where we typically store those transactions these days. So what do we do? In the training that we perform, we talk about a non-historized link and non-historized satellite. The idea is that you could have all the attributes, all the descriptive attributes, by the way, right? Let's say invoice line item description, list price, all these attributes here, and many others. You could have all of them denormalized into the link structure. But then the link structure becomes very wide, the row becomes very wide, and you don't get enough records into the page anymore on the row-based storage. For that reason, we start offloading certain attributes into the non-historized satellite attached to the non-historized link. What I would do is this. First of all, identify those attributes that you need to uniquely identify a transaction record. And we discussed this last time. Yes, you could get away with the transaction ID because it's the sole identifier, But you also want to have the hub references inside the non-historized link, because they are used to build the dimension references for your dimensions in your fact entities, right? So you would typically add from a starting point, right? From starting point to a non-historized link, you add the identifying elements. In this case, transaction ID, the account segment, the accounting document, accounting period, and the transaction timestamp. Those are used to identify the transaction with all. I would add the alternate key and the transaction ID, the primary key, whatever, into this non-historized link for now. We discussed it last time. So that's the starting point. All the other attributes you move into the non-historized satellite for now. And then you look at the non-historized satellite and ask yourself, the ordinary casual user who just wants to build a dashboard, what are they going to query from the satellite essentially, right? And the ordinary user, if they just want to create a dashboard, they typically want to aggregate. They want to aggregate, group by some dimension members. Well, the dimensions we already have in a link. And the problem is now, when you want to aggregate some measure values, you have to join from the link into the satellite to retrieve the measure values. And that kills your performance on a column-based storage, right? So you want to prevent this join, actually. So ask yourself, for every attribute in the satellite, is this attribute part of your typical query? Do the users want to aggregate on those columns, or do they want to group by these columns, essentially? And if they want to aggregate by them, you want to prevent the join, which means that you move those attributes from the satellite into the link, pre-join these attributes. So in this case, for example, my assumption is they want to aggregate, I mean, it's a relatively safe assumption, they want to aggregate on debit amount and credit amount, for example. So I would add them to the link structure, already giving you the answer. All the attributes belong to the link, essentially. Or I would do it, at least. But there could be many more attributes, right? Where they don't want to aggregate on, min, max, sum, or count, or whatever, and where they don't want to group by. All these dimension attributes, let's say, I don't know, transaction type or something, could be in there as well. Do they want to group by transaction type? Maybe. Move it into the link. You could have clear requirements sometimes where they tell you what they want, essentially, right? So move those attributes into the link. So for the typical query, you can run your select, aggregation functions, group by, whatever, from this transaction, non-historized link, for all these attributes without joining the satellite. The satellite's purpose is reduced to the task to capture all the other attributes that the casual user doesn't want typically. Like the data scientists, they need more, fine. But they can join this satellite at a higher cost, right? They have to pay the price now, but they can also deal with this problem by materializing some results somewhere and so on, right? So they can deal with this. The casual user doesn't want to deal with this. It doesn't matter if they can or not. So they just need a dashboard, right? So all the attributes that belong to your typical query, you move into a link structure. All the rest you leave in the satellite structure. That's the basic idea, essentially. All right. So let's see at least the answer, I would say, for especially for row-based storage, but especially on column-based storage. You could also argue, because you're loading data into multiple pages anyway, and as long as you're loading in mini batches into the non-historized link, what I would do is I would tend to become a bit more wider. And we see this essentially in bridge tables. When we prepare bridge tables for fact entities on a column-based storage, especially pure column-based storage. These bridge tables are essentially, we add all the attributes for a typical fact entity on top of it into the bridge table, because it's just additional pages and you want to avoid the join at all cost. So, that's the basic idea. So I tend to become more wider on a column-based storage. Depends a bit on the hybrid storage, right? So like Snowflake, mini partitions, where you have what's called, when you have essentially a both row-based and column-based storage in between, essentially. So that's the idea. But yeah, so that's the idea of the non-historized satellite. It captures those attributes which we don't necessarily need for the casual users, and everything else for the casual users should be in a link structure to avoid the join. That's the best design, essentially, for the non-historized link. Cool, yeah, good question. If you have a question like this, use this form behind this URL here, sfr.ee/dbfriday. That's where you can submit your questions. I'll essentially schedule them in, and once the time comes, we'll answer them essentially. Also check out scalefree.to/webinars. That's where we also provide webinars on Warescape and DBT at the moment, once a month. And if you can't wait until next Friday, check out the Data Innovators Exchange, where it's a community-style forum or forum-style community, where you can also submit questions and essentially get them answered relatively quickly. There's some competition going on between Ignition Data in Australia and Scalefree in Germany or in Europe, where the consultants are encouraged to answer as quick as possible. So yeah, that's also an interesting place to answer, get answers for your questions essentially. Thanks for joining today. Enjoy your weekend, and hopefully to see you next Friday. Thank you guys. Bye bye.